Moving on to modules 2 and 3. So psychology's big issues and approaches and careers in psychology. So natural selection. This was an idea from Charles Darwin, who believed that people attain evolution. Not only people, but all animals and plants, all organisms, they achieve evolution in order to become a better functioning organism that may provide them the best efficiency to live as an organism on this planet. So those is the advantageous traits survive, and those genes that contain the advantageous traits that allow these organisms to survive, they are going to be passed down, and they are called the selected traits. So these selected traits and genes will be passed down down the lineage of a certain organism, and then the descendants of that lineage of that organism will now have all that desirable advantageous trait that allows them to survive better. And then this process will be repeated through generations over generations, and then ultimately leading to the organism's species being the most suitable in order to survive and reproduce in this earth. Now, there is a really heated debate between nature and nurture. So nature is about how inner biology causes behavior, thoughts, abilities. So this is about how you are born with all of your qualities from birth as a baby. However, nurture is about environments. So it's about how environment can affect your behavior, thoughts, and abilities. So today it's generally thought that nurture works on what nature endows, a mix of both. And then a really popular experiment that you need to know in this concept is that there's a concept of how two identical twins, so like genetically identical twins, there will be an example of how they were reared apart from each other in separate conditions. So in separate nurture, separate environments, right? So although they have the same identical genes, which is nature, when they are reared apart and brought up in different nurtures, environments, then if the passage indicates that those two identical twins, if they express the same genetical traits but the different behavioral traits, that indicates that nurture takes priority over nature when determining whether an individual will gain a specific type of personality or some kind of intelligence, right? However, if the passage indicates that a reared apart twin, identical twin, has the same level of personalities and intelligence, then that indicates that nature takes priority over nurture. So this really depends on the type of question that you meet on the MCQs or the FRQs. If the passage tells you that those twins were similar, then you can just say nature takes priority over nurture. If the passage indicates that the two identical twins were really different because they were raised up in different environments, then you can say nurture takes priority over nature. Now the three levels of analysis are biological, psychosocial, social, cultural influences. So biological is the way we're born. So genes, hormones, natural selection, and brain mechanism. So these are what we are born with, right? So the biological concept is indicating how people, they are born innately with all the tools that are necessary for them to live on and develop themselves. Psychological, on the other hand, is about our thoughts, emotions, and learned fears. So this is about learning from our own thoughts and like developing our own thoughts. And this is how we are influenced to think in a certain way, and then that influences our own actions. The social culture influence is about how we're influenced by others, culture, family influence, social influence, and media. So for all people, they have a certain type of neuron, which is their part of the brain, called the mirror neurons. So the mirror neurons, they help yourself to actually mirror or replicate the other people's actions, and then that is how you will be influenced to copy other people's actions when you are growing up. So this is what really causes these social cultural influences, a biological factor, right? So as you can see from this biopsychosocial approach, an approach that includes all three levels, as I have just provided you with an example of how mirror neurons, which is a biological factor, can have an influence on social cultural influences, It indicates how these three factors are actually all connected closely to each other and they are not really separate things. And here is a really helpful chart that will help you. And I'll take 5 seconds for you to take a look at this chart on your own. You may pause the video at this point and take notes on it. And then yes, you can refer to this chart at any time you may need it. Alright, so this chart I think is really important for you to copy down on your notes. So this is just like an abstract of what I have lectured throughout this time. So, the perspective of behaviorism, the focus is on how we learn observable responses. So this is about learning, right? We learn how to behave and how to provide certain responses to certain situations. And some sample questions is, how do we learn to fear particular objects or situations? What is the most effective way to alter our behavior, say to lose weight? So this is like a question that questions on how we should behave to change a certain aspect of our bodies, right? So this can be a good guiding question that you may remember when you have to explain about what behaviorism is and provide an example in your FAQ. Biological, in the meantime, has a focus on how the body and brain enable emotions, memories, and sensory experiences, and how genes combine with the environment to influence individual differences. Some simple questions is, how do pain messages travel from the hand to the brain? How is blood chemistry linked with moods and motives? To what extent are traits such as intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, and depression attributable to our genes, to our environment? Now, cognitive is about how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. So this is about brain activities and our own thoughts and perceptions, right? So some sample question is, how do we use information in remembering, reasoning, solving problems? The perspective of evolutionary is about how the natural selection of traits has promoted the survival of genes, and a question could be, how does evolution influence behavior tendencies, which could be by natural selection, as Charles Darwin has proudly stated. Now, the perspective of humanistic is about how we meet our needs for love and acceptance and achieve self-fulfillment. So some guiding question could be, how can we work towards fulfilling our potential? How can we overcome barriers to our personal growth? This you can achieve by having self-actualization, according to Abraham Maslow, a humanistic psychologist. And the perspective of psychodynamic is about how behavior springs from unconscious drives and conflicts. Guiding question, how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained by unfulfilled wishes and childhood traumas? See, childhood and unconscious, right? These two keywords are what you need to remember about psychodynamic. And also psychodynamic and psychoanalytic, they are just like two same actually concepts that are proposed by Sigmund Freud. But then like psychoanalytic was a concept that Sigmund Freud has suggested, and psychodynamic is a new version of the psychoanalytic theory that Freud's followers later on has made and added to Freud's original psychoanalytic idea, and has like made the new psychodynamic and has upgraded the version of psychodynamic theory. Yes. Now the social cultural perspective is about how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. So how are we alike as members of one human family? How do we differ as products of our environment? So this is about social cultural movements. The point is that there are many different approaches to an issue in psychology, and then the concept of psychometrics is a study of the measurement of human abilities, attitudes, and traits. Basic research is about pure science that aims to increase the scientific knowledge base. Applied research is about tackling practical problems. Hint here, you really don't need to remember about these three concepts if you do not want to, because on the exam they do not ask you normally about these questions. Now, the different types of psychologists and their basic research fields. A biological psychologist studies links between brain and mind. So biological, as I've told you, is about brains and body parts, right? So they will talk about certain brain parts in Unit 3, and then you'll have to connect them to which functions that they hold and have an impact on our minds. Developmental psychologists, they study the change in abilities from womb to adult. So from birth until you die, they study how you develop your cognitive skills. Cognitive psychologists, they study how we think, perceive, and solve problems through utilizing knowledge, memory, and language. Educational psychologists, they study the influence of teaching and learning, personality, investigates their persistent traits. Social psychologists explores how we view and interact with each other. Experimental psychologists, who do experiments. Psychometric, quantitative psychologists, they study methods to measure stuff about people's minds, so intelligence, personality, stress, etc. And the applied research fields is the industrial organizational IO psychologist. So you really don't need to know any of these psychologists or the psychological research fields here for the AP Psych exam, but I want you to remember this single example: industrial organizational IO psychologist. So they study stuff about workplace and organizations to train employees, boost productivity, implement systems, and etc. So on the MCQ, they will ask you to identify which type of psychologist, which type of psychology, field of psychology, would the psychologists be referring to when they are looking into a situation, for example, in which a company is in the process of training an employee, and then if that kind of context is given to you, then you can just choose industrial organizational because it is all related to training employees, boosting productivity within companies, and implementing systems, and etc. So this is like the only choice that you need to remember, and then be able to identify that it is the actual industrial organizational psychologist when a context is given to you about how a company is trying to train an employee. Now, we will just skip this middle part because they are quite unneeded. I'll take 5 seconds for you to look at these keywords if you want to. But these psychologists, they really are straightforward: counseling, clinical psychologist. And then you really, yes, I think you can just study these on your own. They're actually really straightforward. Now, let's look at the important ones. Dorothea Dix is another person, and then you need to remember her for thinking about the patient's rights and the patient's conditions for the mentally ill. And she was the one who developed the first asylums, or asylums. Yes, so she pioneered the humane treatment of patients with psychological disorders. As I've told you, she was the one who developed the first asylums. Then positive psychology, it explores positive emotions, traits, and enabling institutions. Basically, they talk about how can psychology make our lives positive. And this is led by Martin Seligman and others. So psychology tells us about how we think and feel, but remember, it doesn't really help us give meaning to our lives. So this is just a method of delving into who we really are and how our cognitive skills work.